thanks everybody for joining. My name is Miguel Martinez. I am the CTO of Tech Refresh. Also, I help run the DerbyCon community chapter out of Inland Empire, which is in Southern California. Um, Again, this talk is on BitLocker. It's mainly kind of the talk is based around actually a real life scenario that we went through with one of our customers. Actually reached out to us, and we'll kind of go through the two attack methods we went through and what we learned and kind of what transpired. So moving forward. So again, what is BitLocker? So, I mean, everybody knows BitLocker is essentially, encryption solution available in Windows operating system. It can do disk level, volume level encryption. There's multiple encryption methods. There's TPM, which is the chip on the motherboard that stores, helps stores the encryption keys, and essentially is like an escrow for those keys. Specifically, in this talk, we're focusing on TPM only. That's what our essentially our system that we were, or the laptop they were tasked to gain access into was running. And again, as mentioned before, you have TPM plus PIN, which essentially when the system boots up, your user has to enter their PIN. There's also PIN plus USB, which again there's a physical aspect there. And again, like I mentioned, TPM only is transparent. What happens is essentially the key stored in TPM. When the system boots up, that TPM sends over the key and decrypts the drive. As mentioned. Oh, if I haven't mentioned before, I asked my daughter for suggestions on themes for this talk, and her suggestion was to use one of our favorite anime series. So if hopefully you guys can check out Attack on Titan if you're an anime fan. So again, our subject was a HP Elite book, 1040 G2. It's a fairly older system. Windows 10 Enterprise had BitLocker enabled with TPM only, which was a huge plus for this scenario. Windows Firewall was enabled with 0 ports inbound, right? So just by what we have here is, you can boot the system up. You're sitting at a login screen, but nobody had credentials for them. The system had been taken off, removed from the domain. Nobody had local credentials. There was no network access to it. It was essentially hardened. The only thing you can do is try to log in, but there was just, and whoever encrypted the drive originally no longer worked at the organization. So when they encrypted, it wasn't tied to Active Directory. It was essentially somebody saved the recovery file onto a USB, which nobody knew where that was located. And again, the goal was to retrieve the data. That this laptop actually was owned by a pretty higher up executive that actually reported directly to the owners in this big organization. I think multi-million-dollar organization. So they spent a few weeks trying to get access to the box. So they reached out and then spent a few weeks. So that gave us a few days to kind of think about, our attack path and what we could do to recover the data. I mean, this was our first attempt, right? So since we had BitLocker, we weren't able to, just remove the drive and, stick it into another system and decrypt, right? We had to deal with BitLocker, which was enabled. You couldn't boot into into a Linux OS again because that TPM BitLocker essentially prevented you from gaining access into that drive. So our first attack path we went down, our first rabbit hole, I should say, was the cold boot attack. This is nothing new. This was published on a paper from Princeton back in 2008. Essentially, boil it down. Essentially, it was research that found that RAM retains data for a few seconds to a few minutes after you power down the device. And it even becomes more apparent when the RAM chips or the are cooled, right? So the cooler you can get it, the longer the data stays. Again, this attack was from back in 2008. Back in those times, it was really easy. Essentially, what you could do is you take a essentially you take your compressed air can, flip it upside down, point at the memory chip, cool it down, power off the device, power into something else like a bootable Linux OS, and you can read the data off, read the data directly off the memory chip, right? In hopes that the decryption keys were still resonant in the RAM. And again, if you guys have any questions, just pause me, or we can open to having a discussion. So again, this is again our HP link book. As you can see, the RAM chip is right over here. Pretty sure you can see that. Or sorry, the BIOS chip is right here, which I circled. So it was pretty easy to actually locate. There was nothing. It wasn't hidden behind 1,000 peripherals or anything like that, or hardware. As soon as we popped the bottom cover, we're able to locate it and gain access to it. Oops, sorry about that. So what are some of the countermeasures that that this attack from 2008 has now, right? I mean, this is an older attack from 2008. Manufacturers have actually implemented countermeasures since that that paper was published, and one of them, I mean, it's not really a big countermeasure, but tamper switches, right? Some of these laptop motherboards or even desktop motherboards, if the case is open, they have some switches that were, if they're left open, that it won't boot, or essentially if they're left open, it will clear memory during the BIOS post. The other big countermeasure is essentially this implementation. Essentially, it's an implementation that memory that's in the BIOS. It essentially clears the memory. That essentially, sorry, step back. Works with the OS that once a system boots, it sets a bit in the BIOS, and if that during the shutdown process that bit is changed during a clean shutdown. So when the BIOS boots up again, it could read that bit, and whether it was a clean shutdown or not, it can determine whether it needs to clear the memory, right? And this next slide kind of helps show that. So on the top, we have a clean shutdown, right? So let me grab my little pen here. So again, we have that memory overwrite request bit. During the BIOS post, it is red. So as you can see the arrow up. By BIOS, if it's a 0, then it checks whether it needs to clear the memory. If not, then it goes straight into the OS, right? So this is the OS is running in this section here. Once it gets into a clean shutdown, the OS will change it to back to 0, right? So remember, BIOS checks it to 0. Then after it does its check, it sets it to 1, and then it's up to the OS to set it back to 0 during a clean shutdown. On a subsequent boot, let's say if it's a clean shutdown, again, the BIOS will read it. It's a 0, so it's not going to clear memory. Down at the bottom, we see what would happen if we try to launch a cold boot attack and actually, just physically power off the system without doing a clean shutdown. Again, first, this is the first boot. Again, the memory overwrite request bit is set to 0, and then it is, memory is not cleared. The BIOS sets the bit back to 1, and then the OS is running in this section here. If we were to, when we pull power in this section here, that bit is still set to 1. So the next time the BIOS boots, it's going to read, hey, there's a 1 now. In that bit. So now BIOS says, well, I'm not going to boot the OS before I need to clear the memory before I boot the OS. So what happens is the BIOS clears the memory, and then by the time you boot into your either your OS, or let's say you were trying to launch into a Linux OS, that memory is already clear, right? There's nothing there. So this is essentially one of the attack countermeasures we had to get around for this attack. So our setup for the attack was essentially leveraging bootable USB, leverage Arch Linux. For memory acquisition, we used Lime. And then for key recovery, we used the AES key finder, was actually provided by the on the 2008 research paper from Princeton as files for that for that research. The interesting thing, we went with a nice, pretty fast USB stick. So again, the purpose was to boot as fast as we could, so we can get as much RAM out, right? So again, the attack, one of the things we needed to do is essentially get around this memory overwrite request bit, right? In order to prevent the BIOS from changing, right? There was no point in us rebooting the box, trying to boot into Linux, and then pulling memory, since there's just there isn't going to be any data there, right? Because BIOS was going to prevent us from getting there. So in order to do that, what we tried first was, our tried first was actually changing the more bit, right? We dumped memory using BIOS, essentially reader. We connected into the pins with another system, read it, and then found where the bit was, and then pushed changed just that section, right? We weren't trying to rewrite the entire BIOS. That would have taken too much time, so we needed to just reset that bit. But after several tests, we noticed that the more bit was placed in different sections of the memory, so we weren't able to essentially create a script. We weren't able to set something where, okay, just focus on memory, on the specific memory address. We had to find a way to change the bit essentially in a range, which could have found in this particular range of memory. So again, mentioned flashing the entire BIOS was not an option. It was like 16 meg. Which took 2 to 4 minutes. By that time, BIOS would have warmed up, or the RAM chip would have warmed up, and most of the resident memory would have been gone by now. So our plan, or our approach, was to actually flash a subsection of the BIOS that covered the more bit, right? So what we did is we reset the system a couple times, read the BIOS information multiple times, and then just identified where the more bit fell within a particular range of the memory in the BIOS chip. So that the memory address we found that we can overwrite took about 10 seconds. So, and again, this is myself using the UEFI tool to identify the more bit. As you can see, this is essentially a BIOS dump. At this moment, the BIOS, or sorry, the bit is set to 01, which is essentially set to on next boot to clear the memory, right? So again, this wasn't, if it was easy enough if this bit was always in the same section, because we just could have easily just looked at the memory address and say, I want to rewrite that address, set it to 00, be done. Within a few milliseconds, we would have gone into booting the OS. But again, that wasn't available, since most of the memory fell under multiple, or that more bit after every reboot fell into different sections in a subcategory. So we had to take the approach that we essentially had to flash a subsection of the memory and not the entire memory, or sorry, subsection of the memory, not the specific memory, because again, it moved. And actually, let me see if I can share a quick video of me. This was the initial this was my one of the first attempts. This was actually getting a little carried away. I don't know if you guys can see the video, but this is me getting a little carried away with compressed air. The OS on there is actually not Arch Linux. I know this was my first attempt. It was a full GUI. There's that Corsair GTX. On that memory while I was doing the acquisition. And the acquisition only took about 10 to 20 seconds. Once we got it down to leveraging Arch Linux and stripped down. And here's what the ultimate attack looked like, right? So here's our Arch Linux. At boot, there's a service that runs. Essentially, we'll launch Lime, acquire the memory, and dump it straight into the section inside the Corsair GTX, which is also the same USB we use to launch the portable or to launch Arch Linux or to boot Arch Linux. So again, this is the test probes kind of clamping onto the BIOS chip. Here's the BIOS reader and writer. Look at my laptop. So my laptop was used to essentially I had pre-programmed commands to run the programming software to write the specific bit. And again, what we found is actually looking at other laptops. So this was our target. This HP Elite notebook was the target. However, I did look at a couple other manufacturers and BIOS, and what we found is not all of them are the same. In fact, some of them saved that more bit to the same location, which would have made it a hell of a lot easier for us to launch this attack. But ultimately, was it a success? Unfortunately not. We did find multiple AES keys. However, none of them were able to decrypt the drive. It could have been, there's number of reasons this could have been, right? The most obvious one, right? The key probably didn't stay resident very much in memory, or the TPM module, cleared that section of memory, right? So it could have been a number of things that could have prevented us from getting those keys. But after that, we regrouped and kind of stepped back and thought of our next approach and what we should do. And again, this is BitLocker TPM only. So when you booted the box, you can boot into the OS, but you couldn't touch anything you're essentially just staring at a login screen. And there's no network access. You can get it on the network, but you can't talk to it. It wasn't talking to anything. We tried doing, looking at DNS requests or any calls going out. There's very little, as there's nobody logged in. Very little applications running prior to login. So essentially the approach after the regroup is, well, why don't we take a different approach and maybe look at exploiting other things? So that second approach was the DMA attack, or the direct memory access, to essentially to manipulate memory while the system is on and booted, and take control, or make changes, read, write on the OS. This is again not a new attack. This is back in 2012. I don't know if you guys remember. There was a tool that was released, and I actually didn't write the gentleman's name here, but Inception was the name of the tool. It mainly focused on the FireWire, but it essentially leveraged FireWire to talk directly into or use DMA and talk directly into memory, and essentially read write memory bits. So what that means is you could essentially take plug in a device that interacts with that FireWire, look for specific strings or information in memory, and then change that section to whatever. So that means, if you can locate the section that stores the password in memory, or the hash, you can change the hash to something or just clear it altogether and then simply just log into the system. But again, that attack has been mitigated fairly, actually pretty recent, or shortly after that. I think within a year or so, that attack was mitigated by most OSs, which prevented FireWire access into DMA without actually approval, right? So when you plug it in, you get a little pop-up says, you want to give permissions, and you hit OK, right? So that's been mitigated for FireWire, but what about this other tool from, and I'm probably butchering his name, Frisk, which is PCILeech, and this actually leverages PCIe to interact with memory. Same approach. It uses DMA. The neat thing about this, it use common interfaces or common PCIe interfaces like Thunderbolt, M2 slots, Express card, or even mini PCIe. Since we were dealing with the laptop, one of the two things we could have used was Express card, which unfortunately, if I remember correctly, the 1040 did not have an Express card slot. However, it did have an M2 slot actually, and had a few. One for the drive, which unfortunately we couldn't use because we needed the drive on the system to be able to launch the attack. And the other one was actually another section or another peripheral, which was the wireless card or the wireless M2 adapter that we can leverage to launch, or to essentially borrow that to tie into and get access to memory. So what kind of countermeasures are there for DMA or for this attack? Well, actually, Microsoft has the ability to do this, and I believe it's actually introduced in 1809 Windows 10, but it's still not enabled by default. It is you can enable this through group policy. I believe it's the I should have provided more information on this, but it's VSS. I don't remember what the acronym actually stands for, but essentially it can block, disable hot pluggable PCI to downstream ports when the computer is locked. And again, this is available through group policy. So if your organization or industry is concerned with this kind of attack, definitely recommend looking into that. The other thing is having virtualization enabled, which can prevent access to certain sections of the RAM. But again, this is configurable through BIOS. And as we all know, you can get into the BIOS pretty much. If you have physical access to the box, you can get access to the BIOS. If the BIOS has a password, most manufacturers either have a hard-coded password, or there's a method to clear the BIOS or clear the BIOS password through a simple key combination, or shorten a couple pins in the motherboard, right? So that can easily be disabled, which we did. And for this device, actually, the HP EliteBook did not have a BIOS password, so we were able to simply disable the virtualization. We didn't have to worry about the countermeasure, the OS countermeasure being enabled, as we had verified with the organization. They did not have that enabled. In this picture, I actually show the M2 slot that was leveraged to launch the attack. So again, this is the wireless card. As you can see, it's got the antennas still attached to it. So one important thing is it has to be a card that supports PCI, or M2 slot that supports PCIe. In this example, we had an AE slot, M2 slot, that we were able to leverage. Here's again our attack setup, where we used again, this is a USB, actually some step back, sorry. This is our setup for PCILeech. In order to interact with the PCIe, there needs to be hardware, right? So the hardware in this situation was a USB development board. It was a mini PCIe USB development board, USB 3380. It's actually fairly inexpensive. I believe we paid about $150 shipped. Actually, we got it like next day. locally. We had a M2 to mini PCIe adapter here. So again, this is M2. The board is PCIe or mini PCIe to be exact. So this whole ribbon is essentially mini PCIe to M2 to essentially make sure we got the right form factor there. One drawback to leveraging the USB 3380, it is limited to 4 gigs of memory acquisition. Luckily, this laptop only had 4 gigs of memory. Again, if you have a laptop that has more than that, there's various things you can do. One thing is there's other devices that are available that you can acquire. Some are a little bit more expensive, but however, there is benefits to them. You can purchase a FPGA. I'll share the link here, but there's on the GitHub page for PCILeech, there's a whole list of hardware that's supported. Some of them are a little bit pricey, but they do give you faster reads and writes, and they give you unlimited access to the memory. One other thing you can do if your device has more than 4 gigs, if it has multiple memory cards, just remove cards or replace cards until you get to the 4 memory, right? And then you're certain that you can read all sectors of memory. But for our actually example here, we actually didn't need to read the entire memory, right? Normally when a system boots, it starts writing to the first couple sections of memory. So as long as we can read that section that has what we need, we should be golden, right? We don't need the entire 16 gigs. But again, we were fortunate enough that this laptop had 4 gigs of memory. Here's a next picture. Here is kind of a close-up on the USB 3380. Again, this is mini PCIe. This other connector here is USB 3.0, which this side plugs into the attack system, and is essentially where you launch the PCIe software or PCILeech software to interact with the memory. And fortunately, I actually had a video of this, and I misplaced it, or I must have deleted it. But it's nothing more than these following screenshots with actually help show the actual, just the command I ran, right? So this is, as you can see, this is Kali. This is PCILeech, essentially just running the patch command. What I did is I switched one of the signatures is to look for the sticky keys and switch the sticky keys from presenting that that sticky key message to actually prompting a administrative command prompt. Again, so after clicking after entering or running the command, it goes and looks for memory. As you can see, it got through about 10% of the memory before it found it and successfully patched the location. After such, I was able to just essentially go over to the laptop while I was sitting on, it was actually sitting on still on that login screen, and just hold the shift key until I got a command prompt up. And at that point, essentially I had an administrative logon or administrative shell or command prompt, which allowed me to essentially create a user, right? This is not the actual screen, as I can't show the users, but this is essentially what we did, right? So we did the net user command to create a new user, and then we added the user to the local admin. And after that, we were able to use that local admin to log into the laptop and essentially gain access to the data. After which, we did with any during any acquisition, we made a copy of the data just in case anything weird happened to another external drive, and then provided the laptop and external drive to the customer. Again, was this a success? Yes, it was actually a lot easier. I would say by the time I received, again, we ordered the USB 3380 during, I think it was on a Tuesday. We got it by Wednesday. I didn't start working this until 5 p.m. when I got back home. By like 6:30, 7 o'clock, I had access to the laptop and was already copying data. In comparison to my first attempt, which was the cold boot attack, which essentially took me several days to do the research, acquire the, I had to order the BIOS programmer, had to order the that Corsair USB drive, had to essentially build from scratch, not build from scratch, but essentially build a bootable Arch Linux USB, create a script to automatically dump it. And essentially that took me a few days to actually, I mean, a few evenings, I should say, not spending entire days, but a few evenings of me essentially building this whole toolkit just to dump memory from keys from memory, and then analyzing, looking for the keys, and then testing if those keys actually worked. And actually spent a few weeks on this. This DMA attack was kind of our last resort, and actually was very successful. I kind of wish we would have gone that route. My initial thought was that this was going to be a bit more expensive, actually being price-wise, actually being on par, right? After factoring in the programmer, the USB, the Corsair USB, and not even factoring in time spent. I think going down the DMA a path would have been a lot. I mean, it was a lot faster. And just to recap what the attack was, essentially we took that USB 33 development board. We flashed it with the PCILeech firmware, and that firmware is available again through instructions are available through old Frisk's PCILeech GitHub page, or he provides you the firmware for this board. Essentially, you plug it into your attack system, flash it with the PCILeech firmware, unplug it, power back in, plug it into the system, open up PCILeech on the attack system, plug it into USB 3.0, and then boot the system up. And at that point, you can just launch the PCILeech software on the attack system to either patch memory, dump memory, or whatever you need to do. In our situation, we looked for the sticky keys command and replaced it with a command prompt. And essentially, after that, we were able to get a command line or administrative command prompt where we entered, created a new user and added that user to local admins. Again, giving credit to where credit's due. A lot of the kind of the path I took for the cold boot attack was based heavily on the research done by F-Secure. Here's a quick little, there's an article that talks about their research and some of their presentations they did around the cold boot attack. Fortunately, they didn't share the bootable OS that they leveraged to dump the memory. However, it seemed like they were based on the notes I saw and the research and some of the presentations. It didn't look too much different than what I was doing with Arch Linux and Lime for the memory acquisition. And again, thanks to old Frisk for PCILeech. Again, that's available on GitHub with a list of supported hardware, and how to, definitely recommend picking up one of these devices. Probably recommend going for one that doesn't have a 4 gig limitation. Again, we went with that 4 gig just because it was our first time trying it, and it was fairly inexpensive comparatively. But again, I'd recommend having any security organization or even organization, right, having one of these as a means to getting back into systems. But again, thank you. There's a picture of me. So again, thank you for the time. Again, my name is Miguel Martinez. You can find me at DEFCOM. I'm also also my call sign here, W6bit or BIT. Again, I'm a CTO at Tech Refresh. You can find us at techcar.io. Also, if you guys are if know anybody in the Southern California area that's interested in joining or is in the InfoSec community, we'd love to have people join us. Unfortunately, by current situations, we're not hosting on-site meetings, but again, you can find our DerbyCon community Inland Empire chapter at derbycom-ie.com. Again, I'll pause there to see if anybody has any questions or comments.
And people can take themselves off mute to ask a question.
Awesome. Okay. No questions. Great. Appreciate everybody's time, and hope everybody has a good afternoon. And sorry, was there a question there? Sorry.
Yes, I have a couple. Sorry, I had double muting on. It took me a while to get it off. How long did you say it took you to crack into it once you had that card?
I would probably say after flashing, getting the drivers, I would say between an hour from like had the card, an hour and a half to 2 hours by the time I had the card.
And what's the level of technical competence that is required now that you've done this POC?
I would say, I mean, you would probably have to understand a little bit of hardware, definitely some Linux background and understanding on how, I just kind of, I mean, I wouldn't say like very hard, high level, just kind of know enough to understand how memory works and stuff. I think what I showed here is pretty much, that command is pretty much how you run it. Well, Frisk makes it really easy to run this. I think the hardest part was flashing the card, right? Because the instructions were a little bit weak on flashing the USB 3380, or maybe I just wasn't reading the right instructions. But from what my experience is, I thought the card was going to pull power from the USB 3 port, but in fact, it actually pulls power from the PCIe side. So you need to have it in the PCIe. You need to have it, in order to flash it, you need it in the PCIe system that you can access to flash it first. Then you can use it to attack. But once you flash it, you can use it anytime.
Have you tried it with the TPM plus the pin?
I have not, but it will probably, yeah, I have not. Most likely won't work. And again, there's a few other attack methods that I didn't go into that I probably would have kind of got into, which was like actually soldering into the leads on the TPM chip and see if I could read it using like a logic analyzer as it's talking to the board and stuff.
Thanks.
Yep, thanks.
Hello, will your slides be made available?
I could definitely share the slides. I can send you a copy of the slides, Mike, and then I don't know if you have a method of sharing that. Sorry, Mike. Were you there, Mike?
Yes, well, if you send the slides, we'll make them available.
Awesome. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this.
Thank you. Yeah, and you're welcome to reach out to me. You can also send me an email if you guys have any questions, miguel.martinez@techrefresh.com, or you can just probably find through our support portal, techr.io. I'm always happy to help anybody looking for, if they're trying to do this and they're stuck somewhere, happy to help.